You see, there's something particularly unsettling about abandoned hotels. Maybe it's the empty corridors that once buzzed with life, or the silent rooms that held thousands of stories. But here's the thing. Of all the abandoned hotels in the world, few have a history as dark and mysterious as Colombia's Hotel del Salto. What started as a symbol of luxury and progress would transform into something far more sinister, earning a nickname that no hotel wants, the Suicide Hotel. But before we dive into the darkness that would eventually consume this place, we need to go back to the beginning. And I mean the very beginning. The year is 1923, and Colombia is experiencing what many call its golden age of architecture and development. The location they've chosen for this ambitious project couldn't be more perfect, or more dangerous. Perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Tequendama Falls, the hotel site offers breathtaking views of the 515-foot waterfall and the lush valley below. The roar of the falls is constant here, a thunderous backdrop that seems to shake the very ground beneath your feet. You see, this wasn't just going to be any hotel. Architect Carlos Arturo Tapias had a vision to create a mansion-turned-hotel that would rival the finest establishments in Europe. The building would combine French architecture with local Colombian craftsmanship, featuring ornate windows, elaborate balconies, and detailed stonework that would make it look more like a castle than a hotel. The construction itself was a mammoth undertaking. Workers had to navigate treacherous cliff edges while hauling heavy materials up narrow mountain paths. Local records show that 3 workers lost their lives during construction, all from falling from the same section of cliff. But here's where things get interesting. According to worker testimonies from the time, all 3 accidents happened on days when an unusual mist rose up from the falls, despite clear weather conditions elsewhere. The local Muisca people, indigenous to this region, had warned against building here. They had their own stories about these falls, stories that the wealthy developers were too quick to dismiss. They believed the waterfall was created by Bochica, their supreme god, to drain a great flood that had plagued the region. More importantly, they considered this location sacred and dangerous. According to their legends, the spirits of the dead would sometimes gather here, drawn by the power of the falling water. One elder, whose testimony was recorded by a local newspaper at the time, spoke of how the falls served as a gateway between the world of the living and the dead. The mist that rises, he said, is not just water. It is the breath of those who have passed, calling to the living. The newspaper treated his words as quaint local folklore, good for adding color to their story about the modern marvel being built above the falls. The builders, of course, paid no attention to these warnings. By 1924, Hotel del Salto opened its doors to Colombia's elite, quickly becoming the country's most prestigious address. Politicians, wealthy businessmen, and international celebrities would travel for hours just to spend a weekend enjoying the spectacular views and luxurious amenities. The hotel's grand opening was a spectacle that local papers would talk about for months. The ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers imported from France. The floors were laid with marble from Italy. Each of the 18 guest rooms featured hand-carved furniture, silk curtains, and private balconies overlooking either the falls or the lush valley below. The hotel's restaurant quickly gained a reputation for serving the finest French cuisine in Colombia, with a wine cellar that would make European sommeliers envious. But even during that first glittering night of celebration, there were signs that something wasn't quite right. Several guests reported feeling unexplainably dizzy on the balconies, despite not having drunk much champagne. One woman, the wife of a prominent banker, became so disoriented that she had to be physically pulled back from the railing by her husband. When asked later what had happened, she could only say that she had felt an overwhelming urge to get closer to the falls. The hotel staff quickly learned to keep such incidents quiet. After all, this was to be a place of luxury and refinement, not ghost stories and superstition. But what happened next would mark the beginning of a dark pattern that would haunt this place for decades to come. It's now 1928, and the hotel is in its prime. The ballroom is always full, the champagne is always flowing, and the guest list is always exclusive. But on one particular night in September, something happens that the hotel staff will never forget. A well-dressed gentleman checks in alone. He requests the best room with a view of the falls, pays in advance for a week's stay, and asks not to be disturbed. The staff doesn't think much of it at first. They're used to wealthy clients wanting privacy. The man, who signs the register as Eduardo Vargas, carries himself with the quiet confidence of old money. His clothes are impeccable, his manners refined. The only thing slightly unusual about him is his insistence on room 317, even though other, equally luxurious rooms are available. You see, room 317 has the most direct view of the falls of any room in the hotel. The balcony juts out slightly further than the others, creating an almost suspended-in-air feeling for anyone standing on it. The constant mist from the falls tends to make this particular balcony slippery, and the hotel has already had several close calls with guests leaning too far over the railing. After checking in, Vargas is seen taking dinner alone in the restaurant. Multiple staff members later recall that he seemed perfectly normal, pleasant even. He orders the house specialty, pays compliments to the chef, and retires to his room around 10 p.m. That's the last time anyone sees him alive. But here's where things get strange. Over the next 2 days, various hotel staff report hearing what sounds like conversation coming from room 317. A maid passing by swears she hears a man's voice engaged in what seems to be an intense discussion. But when she presses her ear to the door, she can make out no distinct words, just the cadence of speech. After 2 days of complete silence from the room and several ignored attempts at routine housekeeping, the hotel manager decides to check on their guest. What they find in that room will change the hotel's reputation forever. The room is immaculate, untouched, except for a neatly written note on the desk and an open window facing the falls. The bed hasn't been slept in. The guest's luggage sits unpacked, clothes still perfectly folded inside. On the desk, next to the note, is a small stack of photographs, all of the same young woman, all torn in half. The note itself is eerily calm and methodical. It begins with an apology to the hotel staff for any inconvenience and includes detailed instructions for contacting his lawyer in Bogotá. But it's the last paragraph that will haunt the hotel manager for years to come. I came here seeking peace, but found something else entirely. She calls to me from the mist. I can see her standing there, just beyond the railing. She's been waiting for me all this time. You see, this would become the first documented suicide at Hotel del Salto. But here's the thing, it wouldn't be the last. Not by a long shot. Over the next few years, reports of similar incidents start to surface. Some guests claim to hear crying coming from empty rooms. Others report seeing figures standing on the balconies late at night, only to disappear when approached. The hotel staff begins to notice strange patterns. Certain rooms seem to attract more tragic events than others, particularly those facing directly over the falls. One incident in particular stands out. In early 1930, a young honeymoon couple checks into room 315, right next to the now infamous room 317. In the middle of their first night, they wake to the sound of someone sobbing on their balcony. The husband goes to investigate but finds no one there. When he returns to bed, his wife is sitting up, pale and shaking. She claims to have seen a man in an old-fashioned suit standing at the foot of their bed, dripping wet and reaching out toward them. They check out immediately, leaving most of their luggage behind. What happens in 1932 would take things to an entirely new level. The global Great Depression has hit Colombia hard, and Hotel del Salto is struggling to maintain its luxurious reputation. The wealthy clientele that once filled its halls have largely disappeared, replaced by a different kind of guest. People drawn to the hotel's growing reputation as a place of tragedy. You see, by this point, the hotel had gained a sort of dark fame. Local newspapers had begun referring to it as El Hotel de los Suicidas, the suicide hotel. Some claimed the place itself had become cursed, while others believed it was simply the hypnotic effect of the waterfall that drew people to their end. The hotel management tries desperately to combat these rumors. They hire additional security to patrol the balconies at night. They install higher railings and better locks on the balcony doors. But somehow, the incidents continue. Guests report increasingly disturbing experiences, cold spots that move through rooms, the sound of footsteps in empty corridors, and most disturbingly, voices calling their names from the direction of the falls. But here's where things get really strange. In the summer of 1932, a group of paranormal investigators convinces the hotel management to let them conduct an overnight study. Led by Dr. Manuel Rojas, a respected psychology professor from Bogota University, the team brings what was then state-of-the-art equipment: cameras, audio recorders, and various devices for measuring temperature and atmospheric conditions. They set up their equipment in some of the most allegedly active rooms, hoping to document any unusual phenomena. Dr. Rojas, a skeptic by nature, is particularly interested in room 317, where the first documented suicide occurred. He decides to spend the night there himself, while his team monitors other locations throughout the hotel. What they record that night will remain controversial to this day. Their equipment picks up numerous unexplained sound anomalies, voices speaking in both Spanish and Muisca, the indigenous language. But more disturbing are the photographs they take from the balconies. In several of them, dark figures appear to be standing on the cliff's edge. But when compared with photos taken moments apart, the figures are gone. The most compelling evidence comes from Dr. Rojas himself. Around 3 a.m., the team's audio equipment picks up his voice in room 317, apparently speaking to someone. When his team rushes to investigate, they find him standing on the balcony, halfway over the railing. It takes 3 men to pull him back. When he finally comes to his senses, he has no memory of how he got there. But he is adamant about one thing: he wasn't alone in that room. The hotel management tries to suppress the investigators' findings, but word gets out. The hotel's reputation takes another hit, and legitimate bookings become increasingly rare. Those who do stay are often drawn by the hotel's dark reputation, hoping to experience something supernatural themselves. Throughout the 1940s, the hotel tries various strategies to reinvent itself. They rename it, renovate it, even try to market it as a spiritual retreat. But nothing seems to shake the shadow that has fallen over the place. Staff turnover becomes a serious problem. Few employees are willing to work there for long, especially on the night shift. One night clerk, who worked at the hotel from 1943 to 1945, later wrote in his memoir, "It wasn't just the sounds or the sightings that got to you. It was the feeling that the whole place was alive somehow, watching, and the falls, that constant roar. After a while, it started to sound like voices calling out names. Your name." By the 1950s, Hotel del Salto's glory days are long gone. The once pristine building has begun to decay, and the waters of the Tequendama Falls have become polluted from Bogota's industrial growth. The hotel finally closes its doors in 1990, abandoned to the elements and local vandals. But here's the thing: the stories don't end with the hotel's closure. If anything, they become more intense. Local residents report seeing lights in the windows of the abandoned building late at night. Hikers on nearby trails claim to hear music playing from the empty ballroom. And perhaps most disturbingly, police reports show that people continue to be drawn to this location for tragic purposes, despite the building being closed and condemned. In 2011, the government decides to renovate the building and convert it into a museum. During the renovation process, workers report numerous unexplained incidents: tools moving on their own, strange cold spots in the middle of hot days, and the persistent feeling of being watched. One restoration worker, Carlos Mendoza, describes an experience that made him quit the project. "I was working late, fixing some wiring in what used to be room 317. Suddenly, I felt someone standing behind me. When I turned around, there was a man in an old-fashioned suit, completely soaked, just staring at me. Before I could say anything, he walked straight through the wall to the balcony. I left my tools right there and never went back." Today, the building stands as the Tequendama Falls Museum, dedicated to highlighting the region's biodiversity and history. But ask any of the museum staff about their experiences there, and many will lower their voices before telling you about the things they've seen after hours. The most common reports involve the sound of music and laughter coming from the old ballroom, as if the hotel's grand opening party never really ended. Security guards regularly report seeing well-dressed figures walking through walls or standing on balconies that no longer exist. And visitors often complain of feeling dizzy or disoriented in certain areas, particularly near the windows overlooking the falls. You see, some places seem to accumulate darkness, like layers of dust building up over years. Hotel del Salto might have changed its name and purpose, but the weight of its history remains. The question that haunts visitors today isn't just about what happened here. It's about why this particular spot seems to draw so much tragedy to itself. Is it the hypnotic effect of the waterfall, as some claim? The ancient sacred energy of the location, as the Muisca people warned? Or is it something else entirely, something that still walks the halls of this historic building, drawing others to join it in its eternal stay at the Hotel del Salto? In 2019, a paranormal research team conducted a new investigation using modern equipment. What they captured on their instruments was inconclusive, but their audio recordings picked up something chilling. A man's voice, speaking in Spanish, saying the same words found in Eduardo Vargas's suicide note from 1928. "She calls to me from the mist." The answer, like so many of the hotel's guests, seems to have disappeared into the mist of the falls, leaving us only with questions and the haunting beauty of this magnificent but troubled place. Remember, sometimes the most unsettling stories aren't about what we know happened. They're about what we'll never know for sure. And in the case of Hotel del Salto, the truth might be darker than any story we could tell. And if you ever find yourself visiting the museum, pay attention to that strange feeling you might get near the windows, that subtle urge to step just a little closer to the edge. Because here's the thing. Some say the hotel hasn't really stopped accepting guests. It's just become more selective about who it invites to stay permanently.